I'm Sierra O'Brien. I'm an Android engineer at Clubhouse and a Google developer expert for Android. And the playback is very distracting. Today we're going to be talking about watches. And I think that I'm uniquely qualified to talk about this because I have a Google Pixel Watch. I also have an Apple Watch. I also am wearing a regular watch. But a little bit of interesting history with each of these. This Apple Watch is dead, and it's been dead for a long time, and I couldn't even be bothered to charge it for this presentation so that I would have it not dead. This Pixel Watch I get locked out of every time I try to use it, specifically for this presentation. Because I don't use it very often. So even right now, I'm fairly certain of the pattern to unlock it, but like not 100. I can't guarantee I can open this live. In this one, what could go wrong with a regular watch? You have to wear it all the time for it to keep to the time, right? So it's not right. I don't use it to keep track of time. It's purely for vibes, which as an audience member might make you question why I would want to talk about watches with my obviously very terrible relationship with them. But that's kind of why I'm talking about it. These Pixel Watch came out last year at I/O. They were announced, and everyone was super excited that Google had gone all in on different form factors. They had tablets, we have watches, we have our whole Pixel phone. And so a lot of people were really excited about that. And in doing that, they also introduced WearOS 3, Compose for WearOS, and health services. So they introduced this whole suite of watch-related things for developers. And I really couldn't figure out why anyone cared. Because I obviously don't use these watches, any of them, across the board. It doesn't matter what kind of watch it is. And so I ask a lot of people. I said, why do you have these smartwatches? They're expensive. They're kind of bulky. I find them kind of uncomfortable. I almost always have my phone. I don't understand people who leave their house without phones. And when I'm sitting at my desk, I also always have my phone. And if I'm ignoring you on my phone, I want to ignore you across the whole ecosystem. I don't want to know about it on a watch either. But most people answered this question around health. They said, this is the best way to monitor my health day in and day out in a super convenient, easy to use way. And you get all these other benefits of notifications, weather, time, etc. And so that's why I decided to go down this path. I don't really like some of the health watches. It's always yelling at me. It tells me to stand up. I know I'm sitting down. I'm a developer. I'm not going to. And so I need a health app that's tailored to me, the exercises I like, what kind of workouts I want to do, what kind of goals I personally want to track. And so maybe with health services and this WearOS ecosystem and my WearOS watch, I can build something that makes me feel the way about wearables that a lot of other people do. Another fun fact about this talk is this is a pure YOLO talk. I had thought about it. I thought it was really cool. I thought it might convince me on these Wear watches. But this is the first talk I've ever submitted where I really knew nothing about what I was getting into and just read the high-level documentation, let's do it. That's either a humble brag for the end or begging for mercy as we work our way through this. So with that, let's get in. What are our goals going to be for this talk? 1, building a beautiful and efficient Wear app. If you read the abstract, this was in it. We're going to build an app that can help us track our fitness goals. We're going to do this in about an hour because I have been given about an hour to tell you about this. And we're doing it live, so we're doubling down on the YOLO-ness of this talk. All right, so let's go to this core goal of this talk, because the rest are like nice to have. Will it work? I don't know. Of building a beautiful and efficient health wear app. And so we have some tools that were introduced at Google I/O and are available to us that are going to let us do this and do this really timely. So number one, we want it to be beautiful. No one wants to use an ugly app, whether it's on your wrist, on your phone, on a tablet, across the ecosystem. Having a good, expected experience where you can know how to use it intuitively, that's going to be really important for any watch app and really any app in general. And so we get this for free. From Jetpack Compose, which is a framework for native Android apps, but is also available on WearOS. And then for this efficient side, it's really important for both your phones to be efficient, right? We don't want apps that drain our battery. You're going to delete that application. And the same thing is going to go for a Wear app, is that it's a even smaller device. And so we also want that to be really efficient. And so we're going to be able to use these health services, also for WearOS, that are going to help us build that efficiency right out of the box. So what are we going to be building? We're going to be building a native Wear health app using Jetpack Compose and health services. There's a couple of considerations we need to take into consideration for building a Wear app that we don't necessarily have to if we're building a mobile application. There's some things that are a little different, and we want to think about those up front. So number one, when you're thinking about Wear apps, you want to design for your critical task. Wear apps shouldn't be a complete replica of anything in your application. You should really think about what's going to work on a Wear. What are the critical tasks that people need to do often, on demand, and really quickly? The second is that we want to optimize that for the wrist. I've already mentioned that I'm not great at working out. And so standing around doing this for a really long period of time is not going to work super well for me. That's a lot of arm muscle that I don't have. And so we want these tasks, whatever we do with our Wear app, to be really quick actions, something you can consume really quickly and either dismiss, act on, reply, do anything in a really fast, cohesive way. We also want the right content on the right surface. If you think about building a mobile application or using a mobile application, everything is really inside your app. Yes, there are notifications. Yes, there's a status bar. But generally, almost all of your app interactions are actually inside the application, which really limits the total surfaces that you have access to as a mobile developer. On watches, on the other hand, for the WearOS, there are lots of different surfaces, and we want to consider what kind of content we're going to show on each one of those, and if it's the right surface for that. For example, we can add things to watch faces. That's going to be something super small, something you can just glance at, no interactions. It's just something that is important to your user, and they want to see it kind of all the time. So it enhances that watch face. There's also the different faces of the watch. I think they're called something different, where you can swipe in between them. Maybe you want to show a little bit more information, and so you want to build out one of those faces where they land on their time, and then they can swipe and see an instantaneous view of all the important information in your app, in your Wear app. Or you can actually put inside your Wear app itself. Again, thinking about the entire Wear app as being designed for this critical task. We also want our Wear app to support the ecosystem. We're going to be building a standalone Wear app, but that's not going to be super common because they can't do too much. Because again, we're designing for these critical tasks. And so most people are going to have a Wear app. They're going to have a phone. They might have a tablet, laptop. And all of these things need to be connected. And so we can think about Wear as supporting that total ecosystem, where maybe I want to reply to a message on my watch, and I need that to instantaneously pop up in the app version on my phone. And then finally, the last consideration for Wear is offline experiences. When we talk about people like using these for working out, it might involve, I guess, leaving your house, leaving that phone behind. And so you need that experience to be really consistent when they go offline. They might have access to things like Bluetooth, but they might not have access to something like a data network. For example, I'm super cheap. None of mine connect to data. So they all need to provide me an offline experience if I'm going to leave and use those without my phone. But give me, again, that cohesion across the ecosystem when I get back online. So now that we've talked about some specific Wear considerations, let's talk briefly about Jetpack Compose. Jetpack Compose is Android's modern native UI toolkit, and it's declarative and all in Kotlin. These last two things are kind of important in my opinion, but a couple of things to think about. If you're an Android developer, you've used Jetpack Compose before, then this UI kit is going to be really, really similar. If you haven't, though, I think a big advantage of Jetpack Compose is that it is declarative and it is all in Kotlin. Declarative really means that you can just describe your UI, and so you get this really intuitive framework that as we write our code today, you'll be able to really follow along, even though you might not be familiar with Jetpack Compose. It's going to be a lot easier to kind of pick it up and understand what the code is doing because of that readability, because it's declarative and just describing our UI in code. And then the other nice thing is that it's all in Kotlin, and Kotlin is a lot like Java. It is also an object-oriented language. And so if you're familiar with Java, you'll be able to easily shift your mental model to be familiar with Kotlin. So Compose for Wear versus Compose for mobile is going to be really similar, like I just said. But it's going to introduce some new UI components that are going to be specific to building on Wear. We just talked about how we want to design for Wear and have all these considerations. And so Compose for Wear is going to build some of those in for you. It's going to be built to handle the different watch faces. For example, I have a round one, but I know there are a lot of square watches out there. And so these composables are automatically going to move around and fit whatever Wear screen you have. It's going to add some support for that watch navigation and hardware experience. For example, on a watch, you usually swipe. There aren't those buttons at the bottom like we have on an Android device. And so there's a specific navigation library with Compose for Wear. And things like the little rotary input, we have composable functions that will let us get input from those so that we can scroll through our content and use that to interact with our UI. And then finally, there are both new and the full suite of composables from native Android Jetpack Compose. But it does introduce some new ones for some of these services we talked about. It has things like cards that you can swipe in between, chips for displaying lists of individual items, dialogues, columns, and these are all going to be customized and built specifically for Wear. So now that we've talked about Wear and Jetpack Compose, let's talk a little bit about health services. So before health services, if you wanted to build some kind of health app, a custom health app, you had to interact with all the sensors on the device and write really your own algorithms to pull that raw data from the sensor and then use that to power your device. So for example, if you're thinking about an app that works for hiking, and you want to measure something like elevation change. On a lot of devices, there's a sensor that will measure pressure. So you could measure that pressure, use that to calculate the difference in pressure from where you started to where you ended if you're hiking up something, and then use that to calculate the elevation change. That's a lot of physics. That's a lot of math. That's not what most developers want to spend their time doing. And it's also going to introduce really big inconsistencies across this ecosystem. Because if I introduce this in my app and I write a specific algorithm to handle that sensor, and someone else writes theirs, and maybe I consider X, Y, and Z, and they consider A, B, and C in that math, suddenly you're going to get different results depending on which watch app you're using. With health services, it's going to unify that across all of our apps. Health services are going to sit on top of those sensors and introduce algorithms that will take that raw sensor data and feed you data that actually makes sense for managing workout and health-related activities. So some of the benefits of using health services is going to be these powerful algorithms running natively on the device. Efficiency. We talked about how we're using health services for efficiency. And so it's already built to be battery efficient for you. It will turn sensors on and off. It will only turn on the ones you need. And so it's going to take care of a lot of that efficiency concern for you behind the scenes. It's also going to be introduced across Wear 3 devices. So if you build now, you'll have an app that runs across all of those. We just talked a little bit about how if I'm doing math to calculate your exercise goals, then my math might be a little bit different than someone else's math. And so by migrating to health services, we get that data consistency across all applications. And then last, it's going to be activity aware. So it'll know if you're working out, and it'll know if a different app is working out, and it'll be able to manage that across your Wear device. Some of the concepts we need to know before we dive into the code is, one, we're going to talk about data types. These are going to be what's collected and updated while you're working out or while you're using one of these health services. They're going to be things like distance. If I'm taking a walk, it can tell me that. That's going to be in intervals, where it tells me the differences between different intervals of time. We also have statistics that we can get back, things like heart rate, where it'll give me something like that about once a second. A second concept is events. We get events back when we're working with health services. These can be things like goals or milestones, and they can be both active or passive goals. And finally, we're going to have a wide range of exercise types that are going to be supported by health services, and again, manage those sensors and give us back the data that we want. So we talked about health services. Once we spin this up, the next thing that we're going to be able to pull out of that is going to be our health client. And this is going to be the way that we actually are able to subscribe to all that health data in both the background and the foreground. The health client then pulls out 3 different specific clients. So first we have this measure client. We also have a passive monitoring client. And finally, we have the exercise client. Let's look at each one of those individually. So first, this passive monitoring client. Sorry, this playback is very difficult to talk through. The passive monitoring client is going to be something that if you just want in the background, it's going to be good for like steps or heart rate, things that are casual that they're not actively looking at. This is not something you want to do if it's like part of your application where they're looking at it all the time. It's going to take less data. It's not going to turn on sensors as often, and it's going to be expecting to be doing it in the background. This is good for like sleep goals and things like that. Next, we have the measure client. This is going to provide a way to take measurements of health data on a device for a short burst of interactive time. So this is something that you want to use if you're looking directly at your app and measuring something. It's not the right one if you want to do it for working out. So this could be really good if you want to do some kind of heart rate monitor. It's going to up the number of updates from that data source because it's expected to be used for a short amount of time and then not be used in the background. And then finally, our exercise client, which is going to provide a way to subscribe to health data during an exercise. And this is what we're going to be diving in deeper to and actually using to build our health application. So let's get started. Now I'm going to switch. All right. So that's very small. Let me change that. I thought it'd be bigger on a big screen. It didn't update. Let's see. No, it's ignoring me. The guy over there told me it was ballsy to live code, and now we're seeing it live. All right, so while that happens, oh, but now I'm afraid. I know. Yeah. This only changed 1/2. I think that's where I just looked. Right, this one? But it didn't do it. Okay, then we're gonna do it. Because I'm afraid it will need internet if I close it. All right, so usually you're either gonna add this to a project or you're gonna create it from scratch. I've done a little bit of pre-work so that we don't waste a bunch of time setting up dependencies. But for the most part, this is about the Watch app that you'll get out of the box. If you just open Android Studio, pick a Wear app, and use Jetpack Compose. The few things that I did change ahead of time is one, I gave us a couple dependencies, so specifically our health dependencies. And to do that and use this beta, I also need to update some of the other dependencies in our app. And so just running what we have here, we get our emulator built into Android Studio, hello from the round world Android. And that's written in Jetpack Compose. And so we see that we're in a main activity. We're calling our Wear app. Inside our Wear app, we have our theme set up, and then we have just a single text. So now we're going to get started with adding health to that. One thing I'll call out before we get started is that usually I try to keep everything in one file so it's really easy to go back and reference. This one gets really messy, so we're breaking it up into 2 different files. We have our main activity, where all our UI is gonna go, and then we're gonna have our exercise client view model to manage the state of our exercise. So let's get started by first creating our health client. I think I actually got that exercise. So the first thing that we're going to do is create our health client. Our health client is going to be those health services that we just talked about, and then we're going to get the actual health client. So we talked about the kind of that pyramid structure. So health services, entry point to all these APIs, pull out the actual client. And once we have that health client, then we have the option to get any of our other clients. So we talked about how you can get the passive, the monitoring, or the exercise. So I'm pulling out the exercise here. Next, we're going to go create this actual view model. I have my notes next to me. Where I'm going to, oh, don't want my imports. Where we're just going to create a really simple view model. We're going to pass in that exercise client from our main activity, and that's about it. So we can go back to our main activity and create our view model. And pass in our exercise client. We're going to make a couple UI updates just so that we don't forget to do it later. We don't actually need this text composable. And we're actually going to get rid of all of our UI right now. And so instead of passing in our greeting view model, we need access to our view model, our greeting string. And we're going to need the, and so let's switch it out here in the Wear client also. So now we're passing it in. So now we actually have to do anything. If I run this, it's just going to be a black circle. Nothing's going to happen. So we need to be able to get the actual capacities of this, capabilities of this particular device. So we're going to add a new function called get capabilities. And so all of these functions are going to be asynchronous. So we're going to be using a lot of coroutines, which let us launch these asynchronous calls. This get capabilities is going to turn to us a lot of data about our specific capabilities on this specific device. We want to be able to show those in our UI. So we're going to set up a view state so that we can let those state updates flow to our UI so that we're actually able to see them. And so now we'll update our UI state with these capabilities. Oh, need to set up that. So have some mutable state flow, which will let them flow into our application. And now we can just update. To equal, not plus. Great. So now if we go back to our main activity, we can pull out that state. We have our view model. We're going to collect that state, not state flow. Our UI state, collect a state so we can see those being updated. And now we're going to display those in a list. So we are going to do our create a new composable function, and this is going to show all the supported UI, all the exercise types in our UI. And so all this is this scaling lazy column is specific to watches. So this is one of those composables that's introduced, and it just gives the UI a really nice look as it scales through on this round device. We'll see it live here in a second. And then for that, all we're going to do is take this list of supported exercises and display them all in a list. So back up in our main app, we can call this function. And from our state, we have those capabilities. Then we're going to pull out our supported exercise type. And then we're going to make it a list or empty. So let's go ahead and run it. Go ahead and terminate. Oh no. Very good. Oh, yeah. We aren't calling our function again. So when this view model starts up, we can go ahead and call that. This time I'm confident. Yes. So we can see all the different exercise types for this particular device, which ends up being a lot. So we can have all of these different kinds supported on this emulator. But this isn't super helpful. This isn't going to help me track my workouts. This is just a list of things that this watch can do. Probably could find it on a box, probably could find it on the internet. And so the next thing I want to do is be able to start looking at what each of these different individual exercise types does. Is because for each one, we have both supported data types, the data types that are relevant to this exercise, which again is the sensors that Health Services is figuring out for us. It's going to give me information like the supported goals. So any kind of goals I can set up as a user with that particular exercise. And also supported auto pause, so it'll let me know whether or not it can automatically determine whether I started working out. So to do that, we're just going to be able to pull that off their capabilities. So for that, we're going to do our exercise capabilities. And we need to add our selected exercise tab. So we're going to be able to pick an exercise type, and then we want to look at those specific exercise capabilities. So if we go back into our main activity so that we can actually do that, our exercise type button already has an on-click, so we can just add that on. We'll add an on-click here, and it will take an exercise type, and then go to a unit, so return nothing. And then in our on-click, we will call our on-click and pass in the exercise type. And then on here, we will add that here where we're going to call a function in our view model. We got to go ahead and add it. Which, do I have one? We'll set our selected exercise type. And just great. So let's go ahead and call that. So we'll set our selected exercise and pass it in. So right now, we would select that exercise type, and then nothing would happen. We would select it. We'd be able to get those capabilities, but we don't have a way to see that in the UI. So now we're going to add some UI to actually see that. So we'll add an exercise type screen. And so all this one is going to do is take in that exercise type. Again, in this scrolling lazy column, we're going to have a back button because we did not set up our navigation. That's definitely a follow-up for this application. And then show us what exercise we picked. So here in our main app, we're going to use our state to determine which screen we're going to see. So we can wrap that. And so if our state selected is not null, then we're going to show our exercise type screen and pass in the selected exercise type. This also has an on back click, and so all that's going to do is unset that selected exercise type since we're just keying on whether or not it's null. So let's run it again. Yeah, I know. Click the wrong button. So let's terminate that, and now we should be able to see this screen. So now we can go in, we see it, great. It doesn't tell us anything yet, but we can go back. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually get all that data. We already talked about how here in our view model, from our capabilities, we can pull out exercise capabilities that are specific to the exercise. So we're using this exercise type, going back into that capabilities and pulling out all the exercise type capabilities, so things really specific to the exercise we're looking at. So we'll add now a debug exercise capabilities, which again is just going to be another composable function where we pass in those exercise capabilities that we're going to pull off for our specific exercise type, and we'll just display them on the screen. So in this case, it's just a list of titles and information. So our supported data types, our supported goals, our supported milestones, and whether it supports auto pause. So we can add that in. As first, we now need our exercise capabilities. We can pass those in from the view model. And then we can show that debug screen. Not that. I want to actually call it. Oh, I put it in the wrong place. That's why it doesn't like it. Put it inside our column, and then pass in our capabilities. So again, let's go ahead and run it. And now we should actually see information about each one of these exercise types. So UI still looks the same. And we can go into backpacking. So now we still have our backpacking label that we had just before. But now we have all this debug data that's going to tell us a lot about these individual exercise types. So for backpacking, we see our supported data types. This can support distance, two different kinds where we have this is aggregate or is not aggregate, true and false. This interval is those two different type of data types that we talked about, is that we have an interval. It's going to give us some kind of data between different points versus something instantaneous. The aggregate is going to return an average, and the other one's going to return the difference between the two. We have calories, also an interval. So it's also just going to give us some kind of difference between the two. elevation for this one, though, like we talked about with hiking, is we no longer have to calculate that from pressure changes. We can just get the data type back when it's supported. Heart rate is going to be in all of them. And so this is a sample. So it's going to give you a specific value at that time. Floors in this case, absolute elevation. It's a long list for this one. Pace, location, speed. And then we get down to our supported goals. For every exercise type, we're also going to have supported goals and supported milestones. And those are things that we can use to customize our application. So for backpacking, we have supported goals around the duration. So this will say, I want to set a goal to be active for 30 minutes. And this is a supported goal for backpacking. We can do calories. I want to burn X number of calories, and then tell me that I've reached that goal. Also distance, elevation, floors, heart rate, steps. And then we get to the third section, which is supported milestones. So when we talk about goals, those are one-time events. So the first time I reach it, then I'm done. I've reached my goal. I can tap out. Whereas a milestone is going to let me know each time I reach that particular goal. And so we'll set a milestone up here in a bit. And so we'll tell it, here's the initial threshold, and every time you hit this, we're going to update it by this new amount. And so for backpacking, we have active duration, calories, distance, elevation, floors, steps. And then the final piece of information that we have for all of these is support auto pause. And that's whether or not your watch can automatically tell you whether or not you paused exercising simply because you stopped moving. So with all of that information, I'm actually just going to rerun it instead of scroll to the top. So now we have this debug information, and now we're actually going to use it to start an exercise. Because right now, all we can do is look at debug information. It's not super important to us. What we instead want to do is actually start an workout. So we're going to add a start exercise text to our app. And then we need to be able to hook this up. Right now, all we're doing is adding a nice little button. It says start exercise, has a play button, a little bit of UI, because we're going to be designing with Wear in mind. But right now, this button's not going to do anything. And so let's go ahead and start that exercise. So I am going to pass in I'm going to put it ahead of this one. And on start, just going to go to a unit also. And just so I don't forget it, we'll update it here too. And so now we need to be able to call that. And so that means we need to set this up in our view model, because that's handling all of our exercise state. So if we go in here, we can put out the function, maybe start exercise. The reason that we need this function is because when we're talking about health services, it can only handle one exercise at a time across your Wear app. And so you might have multiple applications installed. You might have my Sierra's health app and also your own health app. And so before we can actually start that exercise, we need to make sure that we're allowed to. And so from that exercise client, we're going to get the current exercise information, and we have to handle different statuses. So it might be a different app is in progress, then we can't start right now. If we already have one in progress, we also can't start one right now. But if there's no exercise in progress, then yes, we're allowed to start. And so it's only on that case where we actually want to start our exercise. In these other cases, it'd be good if we were building a robust application to let the user know, like, hey, go turn that off, or hey, we're going to shut that down. But for now, we're only going to check whether or not we're allowed. And so now that we've checked, we can actually think about starting that exercise. Let me close this. I do think my font size changed at some point on this file. Just not main activity. All right, so to start exercise, the first thing we have to define is our exercise configuration. This, by the way, was more complicated than I thought when I YOLO'd the abstract, but here we are. So we have to define the different data types that we want back. So in my case, I'm going to pull back both the heart rate and the heart rate stats, which is going to give me an average instead of instantaneous heart rate. I'm going to define an exercise goal, and I can define multiple of these. I'm going to do one that's going to work pretty much across the board because we're not building for a specific exercise. We're just doing it for any of these. So my one-time goal is that I exercise a specific duration, and my threshold is 60, and this is in seconds, so very low, very doable. But I also want to create a milestone. Didn't update that comment. Where I can do it in a really similar way. It's also an exercise goal, but instead we're going to create this milestone. And so again, so that it works again across my exercise types, I'm going to pick my exercise duration total. I'm going to set that threshold at 60 again. But this time I'm adding in this period. And so what this period is going to do is when I hit that 60, it's going to update to 120. When I hit 120, it's going to update it to 180. And so that's that threshold where I can do it over and over and over. And so once I have both the data types, any goals I want to set up, I create my exercise config, where I have an exercise type. We're going to pass that in from our function. We're going to have our data types, what kind of data we want back. We're across the board that auto pause and auto resume are not enabled. And also, we're not doing GPS. So those are both just hard-coded as false. And then we're going to pass in our actual exercise goals. And with that, we'll be able to call start exercise, pass in that config, and the health services and exercise clients will know how to track and supply me with the data that I want. However, right now, we don't have any way to get that data back. All that's going to come is a callback where health service is going to pass it back up to me. And so we want to define that callback and also call can start, so I don't wonder why it doesn't work. So let's go ahead and set up that callback. So we're going to spin up our exercise callback, which is just going to be a callback that extends this exercise update callback, and we have a lot of functions we have to implement. Most of them, for our cases, are just going to be logs so that we know that's happening, but we have on availability change. This is going to have to do with our permissions and sensors, and it's going to let us know when something like location is available versus acquired versus not available, and also any of the sensors that we need. Our on-exercise update receive is where we're actually going to get updates about those data that we asked for in our config, the milestones we set up, the goals we set up. So this will have to come back and actually implement so that we can see it in our UI. Some exercises are going to support laps. Ours does not. Something like swimming, where we could set that up. It's also part of the exercise config, but it's not required, so we didn't have to do anything. And so we're just going to leave it as a blank function. And then also, we'll get information when this callback is registered and if that failed. Again, I'm just going to log it out and like live code, hope for the best that it works as well as it did last night. We haven't actually registered this yet, so we're going to go ahead and do that. When we're down here in our start client, we can also set our callback and pass that. So now it should be registered when we start exercising. So we could go ahead and run this. Not a lot will happen quite yet. We need to go back in and actually add our function. We see our red line here, and that's for our on start, which we now actually do have a function that we can call. Just start our maybe exercise and use our state, our selected exercise type. And it would potentially start it. We can go ahead and do it. Spoiler, I know what happens. When we do this, go here, start our exercise, we get an immediate crash. And that's because we haven't asked for our permissions. We haven't been good Android developers yet. And so the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually get those permissions. So we'll define here what kind of permissions that we need. In our case, we're asking for our body sensors because we want that heart rate, and we also need that activity recognition because we're doing exercise. Asking for them here isn't enough, so this is the one time we're going to leave these two files, and we need to also add them to our Android manifest, where we let it know what permissions our application's going to use. So we can add in the body sensors, and then also our activity recognition. And then we actually have to ask for those. And so here in our application, we can ask for those. So we're going to use an activity for result, which is going to go out, snag that permission framework, ask for those permissions, and let us know when we get them. So we could, again, run it. This time it won't crash with this exception. And this time we get asked for those permissions. So we can allow our physical exercise. We can allow it access to our sensors. If we went into one of these, we probably don't want to start an exercise yet because we haven't set up any of our updates. This is one big to-do that we have left. So in here, we're going to actually update this. So we want to get rid of our to-do and do our, we can see what we have to do. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually pull out that data from the update. It's going to be all packaged into this exercise update object. And once we have that, we need to handle the state. We need to tell our UI that this exercise has actually started, or it's paused, resumed, or when it ends. And so we'll handle the exercise state that we can pull out of the update. We also are going to need a duration because we're going to show that on our screen. We're also going to handle whether or not it's in progress or if it's ended. So let's get started first with the data. So we're going to pull out the state information. This is going to tell us if it started or not. We're going to get this active duration. We have our latest metrics, our latest goals, and our latest milestones. We need somewhere to put this. We already know that we're observing our view state, so we need to update this as well. I think I have that. Oh, bummer. I don't. Oh man, don't remember. We'll come back to that. I'll be able to pull it out here. So once we do that, we need to handle the state so that we can know if it's in progress or not. So this, even though we called start progress, we can't actually assume our exercise is actually in progress until we get the state update. And that's going to be true for pause, resume, and end, is that we don't want to set our state based on calling the first function. We want the update to tell us when it's actually ended so that our data is really consistent with what health services thinks it is. So we will call exercise state. And so we can pull this off. If the state is paused, we're going to set pause is true, and it also has to be in progress. If it's resuming, then it's in progress, and now it's no longer paused. If we get back ended, then it's both not in progress and not paused. And if it's active, then it's both in progress and not paused. And otherwise, we'll just throw false, false for both of those. We're going to use that to set up our view state, where we're going to use in progress to either set up one or the other. So if it's ended, we can just set everything to 0. These are the ones I need. I'm going to quickly add those because I can't remember the command. Very boring. Command would be better. But just Boolean. Not too bad. So now these are all filled out. So they were also just going to be our default values. It's because our default is not being in an in-progress exercise. Then we need to get our exercise duration, because this does not come back as a simple object. It comes back as two different parts, where it tells me what time it actually measured. That's this active duration time, is how long it's been since it's measured, or what time it was actually measured, and then the actual active duration. And so we have to do a little bit of math to like subtract out that tiny difference between when it was measured and when it makes it back to my screen, and then use the active duration. And so that just, again, gives us that consistency between health services number and our number to keep our tickers in perfect process. And then the last thing that we want to do is update our UI state if it's in progress. Missed this one. And so with that, we're going to set whether it's started, if it's in progress, that's true, if it's paused, and our goals, milestones, duration, and the heart rate. And so since we're running low on time, I'm also going to add our exercise controls so that we can just go ahead and use those, which are just going to be all our pause, and resume, which end up being really simple. They're just a one-line call. And so we need our last chunk of UI, which is going to be an exercise in progress screen. Again, just some compose, taking that data that we just talked about and actually displaying it. And so we actually want to call that. So now we have this exercise screen, and we're going to wrap that also in an if-else. Where if our state is in exercise started, then we want to show this different screen. And so we'll call our exercise in progress state.duration. Should have filled all this out too. That's okay. All right, so we have all the UI, we have all our state, we understand our callback, and if the gods are looking in my favor, it will work. So let's start an exercise. So we have this new UI. We see those updates from the exercise client. Our active duration is increasing at about every 2 seconds. Our heart rate is changing from this data from the fake watch app. And we have the ability to pause that. You're doing great. And go back and resume that exercise. We're going to sit here and watch it for a while so we can see our milestones and goals. But overall, we now have this functional health app. And because we picked active duration and heart rate, which are guaranteed for all our exercise types, we can do this for any exercise type that our watch supports. Down to 20 seconds, and I thought it'd be easier to fill a minute, other than staring at this screen. Down to 10. But with all this, we've set up the basic framework for building a health app. Is it a great health app? No, it's very okay. But now we see our goal and our milestone passing. If we had time, we could watch those keep going, and we'd keep getting those purple dots for each milestone that we hit. And if we stop this, our UI state updates, we go back to our start exercise, and we can go back and pick any of our others. And so this ends the live coding part, and we can jump back into this presentation to wrap up, which says, okay, Sierra, we just spent almost an hour building a glorified timer, and it's not even a very good timer. It only updates about every 2 seconds. It looks horrible, average. Looks okay, in my opinion. It's my baby. But like, why did we do that? And that's really fair criticism. But This might not be the health app of my dreams, but we got a lot closer, and we hit a lot of the goals for this talk. We now know how to build a UI for WearOS using Jetpack Compose, so we can build on this. We know how to set up the framework, interact with this health client, interact with this exercise client, start an exercise, some of the functions we need to check, the data that we get back. And we now understand these exercise types, how to learn more about the capabilities for each exercise type, and how to set goals and milestones so that we can build our personalized app. And so if we go back, look at our goals, we built an average, but technically efficient Wear app for health that could help us track our fitness goals if we spent a little more time on it. We did this in about an hour, judging by my clock, and we did do it live. And so where do we want to go from here now that we've done this? We have certain considerations specifically for fitness apps that we didn't necessarily take into consideration here today in our 1-hour sessions. Is that much like what we talked about with Wear in general, is we want to complement the mobile app. This right now is a standalone single app, just Wear module, but we would want this to be a full-fledged fitness application because we don't want to do everything on the app. We want somewhere we can look at our goals long-term, see how we met those, much like most other health apps. We also want to support long-lived activities. Right now, we're assuming you're never leaving that screen, which isn't the case for most health apps. So we want to think about that and build our app to be flexible, and so that it works, whether they're looking at their app, whether that watches in the background mode, and all of these different things. We should optimize our data collection, and we should also use the hardware. Particularly, we didn't set up navigation. We'd want that to be able to swipe between those screens. And so for us, what does that actually look like? We'd want to move a lot of our exercise callback and all of the way that we're handling that exercise data into a foreground service. That's going to let us get a notification on the watch face when it's not the active watch app. So as they go back to their normal face, they'll see that it's still running in the background and might get updates about that. Right now, all of this starts and ends and dies on the watch. I'd probably want to take that data and supply it to the user in some other app experience. So we'd want to upload that to a cloud or a backend using Work Manager after the exercise is completed and you're back online. And then finally, we want to get more creative and built. We built this really generic version that works for any exercise type because all it's tracking is the time that you're working out. But there are so many exercise types that can support is like pick one and really run with it. One of my favorite ideas is taking my talk from last year on MLKit. They have a pose detector and the yoga exercise type that my watch supports, and building something that's a full ecosystem of both like monitoring my pose and giving me live updates about my exercise when I'm working out. And so this asks the question of, I started explaining in depth how I don't wear real watches. Will I start? No, probably not. But I do want to thank you all so much for coming to my talk. You can find me online, sierrabryan.dev. If you have any questions, I know we're running very low on time. Feel free to come up, or we can do a couple right now. But again, thank you so much for hosting me today.